You are listening to Radio Maria Canada. We now present the Health Hub, hosted by Kathy Biasi.
Welcome to the Health Hub on Radio Maria Canada, exploring cutting-edge health and wellness information and therapies, helping you to take your health to the next level. I am your host, Kathy Biasi, and I am a holistic nutritionist and a professional cancer coach. As a society, we are eating and drinking far too many added sugars, contributing to health issues such as weight gain and obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. Returning to the Health Hub today is Dr. Nicole Avena, and we are discussing the sugar dilemma. Dr. Avena is an Associate Professor of Neuroscience at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City and a visiting professor of health psychology at Princeton University. She is a research neuroscientist and expert in the field of nutrition, diet, and addiction, with a special focus on nutrition during early life and pregnancy and women's health. She has done groundbreaking work developing models to characterize food addiction and the dangers of excess sugar intake. Her research achievements have been honored by awards from several groups, including the New York Academy of Sciences, the American Psychological Association, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. In addition to over 100 peer-reviewed scholarly publications, Dr. Avena has written several popular books, including Why Diets Fail Because You're Addicted to Sugar, What to Eat When You're Pregnant, What to Feed Your Baby and Toddler, and What to Eat When You Get Pregnant. Her latest book, Sugarless, covers the latest science on sugar addiction and how to overcome it. She frequently appears as a science expert in the media, including regular appearances on Good Day New York, The Doctors, and the former Dr. Oz show, as well as many new programs. Her work has been featured in Time Magazine, Bloomberg Business, The New York Times, and many other periodicals. Dr. Avena is a member of the Penguin Random House Speakers Bureau. She has the #2 most watched TEDx Health Talk, How Sugars Affect Your Brain, with over 17 million views and counting. We talk about why sugar is so pervasive in our society, biological reasons why we so like sugar, how we begin to break the sugar addiction, and lots more important information. Stay tuned with us. We will be back in just a few minutes to speak with Dr. Nicole Avena.
You are listening to Radio Maria Canada. We now continue with the program, The Health Hub, hosted by Kathy Biasi.
Welcome back to the show. Today's show has been pre-recorded, so no opportunity for calling in. We would love for you to follow us on our social sites. We are on Instagram, X. Now that I've said Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for so many years, now it's just messing me up. Instagram, X, and Facebook, and we are at the Health Hub RMC on all locations. Dr. Avena, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me back.
It's such a pleasure. How many years ago? It's got to be about 4 years ago. We're just talking off air, about 4 years ago since you were last on the show. And we were talking about something completely different. We were talking about preparing for pregnancy. So this is quite a change.
It is. Yeah. It's crazy how fast time goes. I can't believe it was probably, you're right, 4 or 5 years ago that we last talked.
Yeah. And so over that time, we talked about the pregnancy piece, at that time, but has your work changed, evolved, or is this you've got this new book coming out. Is this all the same, the same premise that you're working on, just applying it in different areas?
That's such a great question, Kathy. I think that what I'm starting to see as I, move through my career is that the research that we've been doing in my lab, looking at how sugar affects the brain and how it affects our health in general, it really touches us in so many different ways. And I think that's how I've been able to see this woven into issues related to pregnancy, issues related to fertility, and now in my new book, Sugarless, really just issues related to general physical and mental health and wellness. And I think that for most people, they find that sugar and how it affects their health can affect them in a variety of different ways and in different ways throughout their lifespan too.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've had discussions about sugar with other guests on the show as well. And what seems to come up is that the pervasiveness of sugar in our diet is due to our avoidance of fat starting 20 years ago. Is that the 20, 25, 30 years ago? Do you find that that is the case, or is there something else going on here with respect to the additives, with respect to the addiction?
Well, I think there's a few different things. You're right that initially, I think our sway away from sugar and from carbohydrates, or I should say towards sugar and towards carbohydrates, was because of this fear of fat that was really imposed on us in the 1990s and the early 2000s, where there was a very big focus on heart health. And in the United States, the American Heart Association came out, and I'm sure Health Canada had similar messaging around the fact that, if you are wanting to protect your health, you really need to avoid fat. And fat is what is linked to heart disease. And that led to this frenzy of people wanting to avoid fat at all costs. And so if you're avoiding fat, you have two other options. You can go for protein or you can go for carbohydrates. And people were going for carbohydrates. And so I think this led down the path of people over consuming carbohydrates and avoiding fats. And over time, I think that led to some other issues that we've seen that have come up, which are the fact that we now have a lot of research that suggests that sugars and other carbohydrates can actually be addictive. They can change the brain, they can change our behavior in a way that makes it difficult to stop consuming them, much like it can be the case for things like drugs or alcohol for some individuals. And so that leads people to over consuming sugars and other carbohydrates. And then the last part of it, I think that is something that we're seeing more recently, is the fact that, even if you really try carefully to eat healthy and look at those labels when you buy products, sugar is everywhere. It's just hidden in so many of the different foods that we consume. And in part, that is to increase the palatability so that people will like the products and want to buy more of them. But in some cases, it's actually included for reasons to mask the off-putting tastes from many of the preservatives and additives that are in so many of our processed foods. So I think that the combination of those three things has really led to this situation where we're over-consuming sugar because we're afraid of fat. And, if it's hooking us and making us feel addicted to it, and then it's also even hidden in foods when we're trying to avoid it, it really makes it difficult for us to get away from it.
Well, Nicole, if you could go over some of the foods that people may not be enlightened about with respect to added sugars. I know when I'm working with some of my clients, when I point out some things, they're shocked at how much sugar is in it, because sugar doesn't necessarily have to taste sweet, does it?
It doesn't. And when I was doing research for my new book, Sugarless, one of the things that I really wanted to do was provide real world examples to illustrate this very concept, because I think you're so right that people are really focused on assuming that if it's sweet, it'll contain sugar. So if you're eating something that isn't sweet, then you don't have to worry about it having sugar in it. But that's absolutely not the case anymore. We've been able to see sugar found in things like bacon, for example. Mm-hmm. Also, another one that was really interesting was English muffins, which again, you don't necessarily assume they're sweet and they don't taste sweet, but if you look on the package, they contain added sugar. Also, one of the biggest culprits, I think, for many people are condiments. So,
Hmm.
salad dressings. I've seen people who will create this gorgeous, delicious, healthy salad and then douse it with salad dressing, which is fine. But there's so much sugar in the salad dressing, they might as well have had an ice cream cone.
Yeah.
So it's really difficult because a lot of it is the marketing of products and our just assumptions. We assume, the thing you would dress a healthy salad with will also be healthy. But in many cases, that's not how it works these days. So we do need to be really mindful and understand, when we're looking at products, how to read the nutrition label, how to understand the different ingredients and what they are so we know whether or not something has sugar in it.
When we're talking about sugar, when we're talking about your book, I think it needs to be differentiated between sugar that you're speaking of, additive sugar, versus the breakdown of carbohydrates into sugar. I think, so we don't go on this avoid all carbohydrates like we did with the fat. We seem to what are we, 30 years now since we're hammering a macro. And I think we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater by saying, avoiding carbohydrates. Can you help us delineate where that line is between the carbohydrates that maybe we should be avoiding, healthy carbohydrates? I've even seen diabetic diets that rely heavily on carbohydrates. So I find that that's confusing to a lot of people. Can you enlighten us on that scope?
Yes, absolutely. It's such an important point, and I'm very glad that you brought it up. When I talk about cutting back on sugar, cutting back on, the types of foods that are highly processed foods, I'm talking about those foods that have added sugar in them. And I think that and I talk about this in my book, Sugarless, I walk through the science of why we need to focus on added sugar in particular, not carbohydrates in general, or the sugar that our body will naturally make. And, part of this is that even if you don't, let's just say you go on one of these extreme diets, which I don't recommend, where you don't have any carbohydrates. Well, guess what? Your body is still going to make glucose. Your body will make sugar because your body needs sugar as a fuel. And so even if you're not consuming carbohydrates, you're still going to have sugar in your body. So there's really, in my mind, no need to cut out all carbohydrates. It's really cutting out those carbohydrates that have added sugar in them, because those are the ones that are elevating our blood sugar levels. They're activating our dopamine system and affecting our reward system and setting it into overdrive. They're also the ones that have lots of other items in them that are part of the processed food industry that have lots of additives and preservatives, things that we don't need, things that are not good for our health, things that have no nutritional value. And so for me, it is difficult for people to understand, where do we draw that line? And what I advise in the book, and what I, often will tell people is, if it's a sugar coming from nature, so if it's a piece of fruit, right, that's something that should be a part of your diet. But if it's a synthesized man-made thing like a fruit roll-up, then that's something that you probably want to avoid or minimize consuming. And so it's really, I think, about, coming up with your own sort of inventory of foods that you perceive as healthy and good for you. And hopefully those are all the foods that are, wholesome and minimally processed. And then trying to really limit or avoid those highly processed foods, because those are the ones that are causing all the health issues that we're talking about.
Well, the piece with the natural foods here is fiber, and fiber controls. Before we get down that path, why don't we talk about the physiology of what a hit of sugar does to the body?
Yes. So when we consume something that has added sugar in it, what ends up happening is there's actually a few different responses that occur simultaneously. So when you have that sweet taste hit your mouth, it's going to release neurochemicals in your brain, like dopamine. And dopamine is actually one of the neurochemicals that's released as soon as somebody takes a hit of a drug or uses alcohol. And what happens is that we've seen through our research, and others have shown this in studies, that when sugar is consumed, it overactivates that dopamine system and it causes this cascade of events in the brain. And so at first you feel really good. And I think people can relate to this, where you sort of get this momentary, feeling of pleasure from consuming the thing that has sugar in it. But what ends up happening is that over time, our brains develop tolerance. And so that little bit of sugar might not do it anymore. You might need more sugar and more sugar and more sugar in order to feel that same good feeling that you used to get from just a little sugar. So you can see that over time, this can cause a problem because people end up seeking out more and more and more sugar in order to feel good from it. And on the other side of that, when you don't consume sugar, if you cut back on it and you make efforts to really try to reduce it, it can be difficult because you go into withdrawal. Your brain actually shows changes that are similar to what you'd see if somebody was in withdrawal from nicotine or from morphine. And that can cause cravings, that can cause irritability, lethargy, all of these sort of uncomfortable feelings that we can rectify if we have some sugar. So you can see how this vicious spiral emerges where people end up binging and become tolerant to sugar and consume more and more of it. And then they feel guilty and they make the decision that they want to cut back, but it's so difficult because of the change in the brain that has occurred. And that is where I think a lot of people are getting stuck. And I think that's where learning about, how you can manage your intake of sugar, how you can navigate this sugar-centric society that we're in is really just so important for people to be successful.
It's like the perfect storm, isn't it? Because our body does need glucose. It needs it for brain function. It needs it for energy. So you've got these added sugars that are hyper overdoing what the body needs, yet not in an emotionally negative way. And to me, that is almost more addicting than, say, a drug, because your body does need and produce the glucose for our system. Tell us about the importance, because you're hitting this from the addiction, the neurological place. That's your baby. Where does this fit into, like, what I'm telling somebody? You need to keep your blood sugar balanced so that these cravings don't occur. Or is there a cross section?
There is. And one of the things that we've learned from the research is that a lot of the emotions and these feelings that people get when they're feeling that sugar high, or they're feeling the lows and the blues because, they haven't had sugar in a while and they're in withdrawal or they're having a craving, they are linked to blood sugar levels. And so the blood sugars in our blood connects to our brain. And there are correlations between those spikes in blood sugar levels and many of these neurochemicals that we're talking about that are involved with the reward process. And so if you want to avoid what I kind of see as emotional dysregulation, where you have these ups and downs in your mood that you end up self-medicating with by using sugar to kind of even them out, what ends up happening is that, your blood sugars are up, your blood sugars down, they're all over the place. The best approach would be to eat in a way where you're not going to those extremes, where you're able to have, like you said, steady blood sugar levels that aren't, showing these exaggerated spikes because you just had this exorbitant amount of added sugar in something, followed by these precipitous drops that are going to make you feel weak and hungry. The best way to do it is to eat in a way where you're going to maintain that steady blood sugar levels, so that not only will your sugar levels be steady, but your neurotransmitter levels are going to be steady, your mood will feel steady, and just overall you're going to be in what we refer to in neuroscience as homeostasis. You'll have balance. And I think that's really key in what people should be striving for.
Now, this may be beyond your research, or it may be right in your wheelhouse of it, and these things just pop into my mind as you're talking. We jump onto trends, we jump onto therapies, and then it seems that these therapies that we all love, the research starts to come out, and they're not all the golden child. And what I'm aiming for here is intermittent fasting. And, there are new studies starting to come out, especially with respect to women and the hormonal changes, that something like an intermittent fasting may not be appropriate in all situations. Have you done any research with respect to hormonal changes within women in particular, and with intermittent fasting with respect to addiction and what you're talking about here?
Yes, we actually have looked at this, and I talk about it in Sugarless because I think this is an important thing. And you're right that, we get these success stories that get perpetuated in the media. And I think intermittent fasting is one of those examples where there have been people who, have had great success losing weight, or, reducing their A1C levels, or reducing their blood pressure using this approach. And I think people see that and say, wow, that's for me. I can do that. And I think that there's a few problems with it. One, with intermittent fasting, it's a very broad term, and it means different things to different people. When, I hear intermittent fasting, that could mean a lot of different things. It could mean, okay, I've heard people define intermittent fasting as, not eating anything for 12 hours. And I don't know if I consider that intermittent fasting. I think that might just be normal behavior, because if you go to bed relatively early and you don't eat for a couple hours before bed, and then you wake up and maybe, have breakfast, that's probably a good 12-hour stint if you're lucky. So I don't know. It's different depending on who you ask. And then there's obviously extreme forms of it where people will go for 20 hours without eating any food, and then have this small window where they do eat. So again, getting back to your point of the hormone piece, we have to remember that when we do these extreme periods of time where we don't eat, our body reacts by thinking that we're in a stressful situation. So when we think food is scarce, or when our brain doesn't get food for a while, it begins to think food is scarce. What ends up happening is that we release the hormone cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And that's basically like the fire alarm going off, warning the rest of our body that we haven't had food in a while, be on high alert. Who knows when we're getting our next meal? So we have to reserve all of our resources. And so one of the things that gets sacrificed as a result of that, and this is difficult, especially for women who are in that menopausal, perimenopausal period, is that the body's reaction is to store fat and to keep that fat stored, because we need to store fat because we don't know how long it's going to be until we get our next meal. Now, I think that when we think about this, from an evolutionary standpoint, it totally makes sense, because that's how we evolved. Our ancestors lived that way because they would intermittent fast. They would go for a day or maybe, multiple hours without a meal, and then be able to eat and then, survive that way. So I think that we need to keep that in mind, that our body doesn't know that we're planning to eat again, right? Our body doesn't know that, okay, we're going to break this fast in another hour. And so when you do these prolonged periods of time, your body's reaction is going to be to store fat. And if your goal is to burn fat, then that might not be the best approach to doing so.
It's very interesting, the research coming out now, but it makes so much sense what you're saying. Let's take a quick break here, everybody. We will be back in just a couple of minutes.
You are listening to The Health Hub here on Radio Maria Canada, a Catholic voice wherever you are. To contact us and be a part of the show, email thh@radiomaria.ca. We now continue with the program. Here once again is your host, Kathy Biasi.
Welcome back to the Health Hub. We are having a great conversation here with Dr. Nicole Avena. Let's continue along this path. Let's start picking apart your book too. But just to sort of put a bow on what we talked about the first half, hidden sugars, there's one big one that hasn't come up here, and that's alcohol. Alcohol is a social thing to do for the most part. We're talking generalizations here. So desserts, we're heading into the Christmas season. This will be aired after the Christmas season, but I mean, it's all relevant. The social pressure of those, and how do we avoid or deal with the social pressures, especially, sweets is one thing for sure, but especially with alcohol. I think a lot of people feel a little funny saying they don't drink or they don't want to drink. So how do you suggest people approach that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that, sugar and alcohol are similar in this respect, where people often find that they need to justify their behavior to others. And sugar and alcohol are often the things that are kind of pushed on people, and people will not always be afraid to kind of question, well, why don't you want a piece of cake? Or, well, why aren't you having a drink? Or come on, have a drink. Like, it's one of those things where, there is this social pressure that you don't necessarily see with, like if everybody was going for a run, no one's going to push you to go for a run if you don't want to go, right? It's just one of those things where, people don't really bother you about certain things, but sugar and alcohol seem to be a little different. And I think that part of it is the fact that, they are so pervasive. And another part of it is that people are trying to, I think, justify their own behavior.
Yeah.
You'll never see somebody who's not drinking, like, quizzing you as to why you're not drinking, right? It's usually people who have a drink or two already that, want you to join in. And so I think that, it's important for people to be aware of that and to be aware of the social pressures and kind of be equipped with dealing with them. And one of the things I often tell people is, you have to remember, you don't have to justify your behaviors to anybody. A simple no, thank you, I'm good, sternly said, can get the message across. And I think that it's important to, have that confidence and that motivation to say no, because it can cause some people to easily be swayed to, all right, fine, I'll have a piece of cake. But if you're not intending to have a piece of cake or you don't want the cake, don't have it. Don't feel socially pressured to have it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that it is important for people, to have that confidence and to have their kind of line ready, in terms of how they're planning to respond when they do encounter someone who's a bit aggressive with pushing those things on them.
Within the bar space, the alcohol space, I think it's important to note as well that alternatives to alcohol can be quite high in sugar. Now, I have seen a big increase in the non-alcoholic mocktail sections of restaurants. I think it's really becoming a thing. And I think bartenders are becoming extremely creative with making flavorful mocktails that, you're part of the party. You've got the pretty drink, you've got a mocktail. And I think this is really becoming a big space. And I think it's wonderful. But I also think it's important, and maybe you can speak to this as well, to point out that sometimes these alternatives are quite high in sugar. Have you come across this at all?
Absolutely. I was actually just looking at some new mocktails that someone had introduced to me very recently. A lot of the mocktails too are incorporating functional ingredients like ashwagandha or L-theanine or some of these other, supplemental ingredients that are shown to help sort of reduce your mood and calm you. And so the idea is that maybe you can get the same effect that people think they're getting, at least from alcohol, with some of these functional non-alcoholic beverages. And I think that you're right. There's a place for them, and that's wonderful that there are alternatives, but we do need to be mindful of the sugar, because I've seen some that have really high levels of sugar. And so I think that it's great to have these options, but it's also important to make sure that they're healthy for us. And just because, it's an alternative to alcohol, we don't want to, replace one bad with another. I think that, just talking to the bartender, whoever's preparing it, is a great way to, make sure that it doesn't have enough or doesn't have added sugar in it. I went through this a couple of weeks ago when I was planning a launch party for my new book, Sugarless. We were having a little party at a restaurant, and I made a point of telling the caterer that I wanted to make sure there's no sugar in any of the beverages that we served. And so they were able to create these delicious mocktails that had no added sugar. And I mean, they were just great. And so it's really just a matter of getting creative and using the right combinations of things, and you can still have a great party and enjoy yourself.
Yeah, it used to be if you didn't want to drink, it was water or pop. And I think pop's been hammered enough that people have started to look for the alternative. So it's a great, great thing that's happening. And it's just buyer beware, like everything else. Now, within your book, you have ways or a 7-step program to help people beat sugar addiction. And before we get into the 7 steps, I'm just wondering, this has been such a big thing, a big topic in 2023, the wearables and biohacking. Do you think that there is a place for these glucose monitors, continuous glucose monitors, within people that aren't diabetic, with people who are just trying to make sure their sugar levels are within a reasonable range? Is biohacking one of the processes you recommend? And B, do you see relevance to it if it's not?
I think that the term, I don't know if I love the term biohacking, because I think biohacking kind of suggests you're like secretly sneaking in some way, right? This like backdoor way to get in and get something. And I don't know. I feel like when we talk about things like wearables and, the CGMs, to me, it's really about information gathering. It's collecting our own data on ourselves, right? Because we're loving this experiment that we're living. We're in it. We are the N=1 of our life. And so I think that, when people are using wearables and getting all this data about what happens to their body in response to different foods that they eat, or getting information about how much they slept last night, or getting information about how many steps they took, or how, tracking their food, I think that it can really be beneficial because it helps people to put things into perspective and to make realizations. Like, for example, I've tried out some CGMs, and I found that the foods that I thought would send my blood sugar through the roof actually really didn't. And, it was also the case that different times of the day, I was more susceptible to having my blood sugar go up in response to certain foods than others. And so I think that it can really be helpful for people who are just trying to get more information about how different foods affect them. And then they can make better decisions about what they eat, or when they eat, or how much that they're deciding to eat of these different types of foods. So I do think that there's a place for them, and I think that it can be useful. I do though think that there's a very big difference. I think we need to be, mindful and respectful of people who are struggling with diabetes, because, it's fun to get information about how a banana affects, my sugar levels, but it's a very, very different story for, a 10-year-old girl who's got type 1 diabetes to know if that banana is going to set her sugar into a life-threatening area.
Right.
So I think that to me, it's two different spaces. And I think that, using these tools to be able to educate ourselves about what our body's doing is great. And I think that it can be a useful addition to the knowledge base that we have as we're trying to improve our wellness.
Okay, beyond that, then, if someone has, we'll call it a sugar addiction, are there signs that I'm always into reading the signs of, their bodies giving you, I much prefer to go down that pathway. Are there telltale signs that would clue us into the fact that we need to address our sugar intake?
Well, one of the things that's so difficult about sugar addiction is that there are signs, but many times the signs are things that have unfortunately become normalized in our society. And so, for example, when we define addiction, we use the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder. And so there's a list of different criteria that one needs to meet in order to be diagnosed as having, what's colloquially called an addiction. And when we apply those criteria to things like food and sugar in particular, it can be difficult to detect because they've basically become normal behavior in society. So for example, binging is one of the criteria for addiction. And you can clearly see when someone is binging on alcohol because they get intoxicated and, there's obvious physical signs that occur. And when we talk about sugar, though, people binge on sugar and they don't get intoxicated. So there's really no way in which they're kind of being drawn back, right? And so it can be difficult for people to even see that they're binging on it. But then once they realize, oh, wow, I've ate, half a bag of, cookies, or I ate, much larger portion that was intended, that can start to be an indication that something might be awry. And I think the other criteria, it's the same situation where, sometimes people will have an overt health issue, like let's just say diabetes, or maybe they have developed high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, obesity. And then they can say, well, I think that this might be linked to my diet. I think that it's difficult for me to cut back on sugar. And they can see that they, have the criteria for addiction. And that can be what helps them to recognize it. But that's not always the case. There are plenty of people who are on paper perfectly healthy, but still struggle with sugar addiction. And over time, unfortunately, their health might not always stay that way, right? We might find that over time, they might start to develop some of these diet-related health conditions. So it can be difficult for people to know whether or not they have it. But what I suggest, and in the book, I have a quiz that people can take to help you really assess your relationship with sugar so that you can see whether or not you do meet the criteria for having an addiction.
Well, where do people go if they're stuck? What are the first steps? I know that in your book you're outlining them, but can you give us a general sense of, what a first step would look like?
Well, I think the first step is probably the most important one, and this could be difficult for a lot of people, but it's essentially just admitting that you do have an addiction. And it can be simple for some because, maybe they have a more open mind when it comes to terms like that. But a lot of people have a really hard time admitting that they're addicted to something. There's a lot of stigma and shame around addiction. And we see this in the alcohol field where, people are very resistant, who are alcoholics in many cases, to admit that they have a problem with alcohol because of the stigma that's tied to it. And we see the same thing that can happen when it comes to things like sugar too, where people really just are resistant to kind of adopt that idea that, yes, I do have a problem and I need to do something about it. And so I think really just admitting is the first thing that people need to do. And, that's the first step toward making a change and to deciding that, the way I'm living and the way I'm eating is just not good for my health. And I want to make some of those changes that are going to make my health better.
See, defining that addiction would seem to me to be difficult, like for someone to sit in their own space and say, yeah, I think I have a sugar problem, because you can have the person who has to have sugar every day. You could have the person who every other day or every third day just goes hog wild. So what are the parameters for addiction?
Well, again, this is another issue that I think we see with other types of addictions as well, not just sugar. Because just like with alcohol, I go back to alcohol quite a bit as an example, because I think there are so many parallels between what happens with sugar and what happens when people drink alcohol. You could have the same thing where there's people who are, drinking regularly and would meet the criteria for, having a problem with alcohol, having a substance use disorder, but they're functioning well and they're fulfilling all the role obligations. They're happy, they're, doing what they need to do to function in society. Whereas you might have somebody who, maybe is binge drinking on the weekends and, maybe getting in trouble with the law or, not fulfilling role obligations. And so is it really the amount that someone's consuming or the result of their behavior that is what determines whether or not someone has an addiction? I would say it's the amount. I mean, the results of someone's behavior are societal determinations. You can get in trouble for drinking too much alcohol because, we have laws around it. You can get arrested if you are driving a vehicle, if you have too much of it, because you could hurt somebody. We don't have laws around it with sugar because you're not going to hurt anybody if you're eating too much sugar, but you are hurting yourself. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind that, we have this variation in how much people use these things. And I think that depending on how well someone is able to function shouldn't necessarily be what determines whether or not they have an addiction. And I think that's all too often the problem is we wait till people hit what's, known as rock bottom, right? Where someone has this major problem. And I see this with sugar too, where people will think everything's fine until suddenly they go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, you're pre-diabetic, so you need to be on this medication, or, well, you've gained 50 pounds and you need to lose weight because you're at risk for all these different issues with your health. And I think that it's important not to wait till rock bottom, not to wait till there's a problem. We should be working toward preventing a problem. And that's why I think it's important for all of us to get on board with minimizing our sugar intake and getting it under control so that we can avoid a lot of these diet-related problems that plague so many people.
Absolutely. And we all also have to, realize that each person is an individual, and what impacts one person in one way doesn't necessarily impact somebody else in the same way. So I think, as has been said 110 times on the show, you've got to take care of your own health. You've got to look within. You have to find out and really examine how your actions, how your diet, things like that are impacting your own health. Let's talk about the book a little bit before we end. When is it coming out? Where can we get it? All of that stuff. You have wonderful, wonderful forwards. It's Katie Couric and Dr. Amen, and that's just sets the book up to me as something that must be read. So congratulations on that alone. That's wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. So yeah, Sugarless comes out December 19th, 2013. It's available for pre-order now, and I think by the time this airs, it'll be out and in the stores. So definitely, you can find it anywhere that books are sold, or you can find it online. And yes, I'm very grateful, to all the people who supported the book. Dr. Daniel Amen's a good friend of mine, and he's written the foreword. And he also shares in my opinion and our opinion on the dangers of sugar. And he's a big advocate for people reducing the added sugar in their diet. And he's seen firsthand in his practice the dangers that it can pose to individuals' health. When you look at someone's brain who's been overeating sugar and you see the damage that can ensue, I mean, it's changing your opinion greatly, right? Because you can see how, our brain is so affected by what we eat. And so I think that hopefully this book will help to give people some extra advice and educate them about sugar and how it affects our health. And one thing that we didn't touch on that I do talk about in the book is it's not just about our physical health, but our mental health as well. There's been a lot of research coming out over the past few years, and I go over this about the links between sugar intake and mental health. Feelings of sadness, loneliness, feelings of anxiety are all being linked to our diet, and sugar in particular seems to be one of the culprits in perpetuating those behaviors.
Yeah, it's a cycle, isn't it? You feel bad, you have the sugar. Sugar makes you feel good. It is a cycle with that. Thank you so much for joining us again, Dr. Avena. The book comes out December 2023. It's called Sugarless. Get it. It's an important piece for your health. And as I said, the forwards are wonderful, and it's just something that you probably should have. So everyone, thank you. Nicole, actually, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
And everybody, we'll talk to you next week on The Health Hub.
You have been listening to The Health Hub, hosted by Kathy Biasi, here on Radio Maria Canada.